The sun cut the courtyard in half that day. It poured across the tiles like a harsh truth. I stood in the doorway and watched my life shrink into a small carry-on bag at my feet. The house that had held our birthdays and funerals and the tiny ordinary mornings now felt like someone else's property. Cold, unfamiliar, deliberate. She came toward me with a voice that had been softened by years of evenings together. But it carried a distance I could not cross. Her smile was practiced, the kind people use before they close the door on a conversation. Her husband leaned in the archway, one foot hooked against the frame, arms loose, easy, as though he'd been waiting for this curtain to fall. He looked at me the way people look at bad weather. Annoyed, inconvenienced, ready to move on. I had a dozen things to say. I could have named every sacrifice I'd made. I could have listed hospital bills, tuition slips, overtime shifts. I could have told them how I'd mortgaged a small piece of land to pay for her university, and how I'd slept on the floor while she slept in a room lined with new curtains. None of that rose up when her words came like a verdict. She spoke about management. She said it calmly, as if arranging money was a household chore rather than the erasure of a man's routine. It will be easier, she told me. For both of us. Her eyes never met mine. Her fingers toyed with the hem of her kurta. A nervous habit turned into armor. I asked for a moment, just a word behind closed doors. She shook her head as if denying a child. The house was full of witnesses, walls that had once learned my laughter, but they offered no shelter now. People gathered on the street, without the courage to speak. They watched as if watching a slow, uncomfortable play. I noticed Mrs. Khan at her balcony, fingers hooked around the rail, lips pressed thin. The teenager from next door pretended to fix a bicycle just to get a better look. Some phones were out, lenses pointed, a shy audience hungry for someone else's misfortune. I felt their eyes like windows opening on me. Each glance was a small blade, curiosity, judgment, a whisper that wanted to be louder. My hands trembled. The strap of the bag bit into my palm. Inside were 3 shirts, a pair of old trousers, the photograph of a sunburned child with fingers sticky from ice cream. I had taken that photo the summer she turned 8, when she insisted on holding the biggest cone possible and the drizzle melted it down her wrist and made her laugh. I pressed the frame against my chest and felt the glass bite the ribs of memory. She crossed her arms then and called her husband by a pet name that used to make me smile. Now it sounded like a secret code. He straightened, walked to the gate with that exaggerated civility of people who feel they are doing a favor. He opened it for me as if opening a present. He bowed slightly, a show of mock respect that had nothing to do with me. The gate swung back. Its hinge made a small final sound, the kind of note you hear when a page turns and you know the chapter is ending. I walked across the threshold. The porch tile against my soles felt warm, full of echoes. Each step was measured, deliberate. I did not want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me stumble. Pride is a thin thing. We keep it until it is the only thing left, and I clung to it. The street smelled of sun-warmed dust and frying oil from the tea stall down the road. I could hear a radio playing a song from some other life. Laughter floated from a balcony, distant and oblivious. At the corner, a child ran past. A kite string looped through his fingers. And for a moment, the world looked ordinary. I wanted to chase him, to sit on that porch and watch him climb the roof, to tell stories about when I was young and foolish and fearless, but the ordinary had slid out from under me. My home had been turned inside out. The familiar places, kitchen counter, hallway nook where I kept my sandals, felt like strangers' rooms. Even the air seemed to acknowledge that I no longer belonged. Memories hit me in waves. I saw her small fists clinging to my finger, the first time we crossed a busy road. I saw the crooked knitted sweater I made when the winter came early. I saw the night I sat awake with her fever and how I whispered nonsense prayers. Because there were no words strong enough, those moments had been the foundation of my life. I had believed that foundation would hold when the winds came. I had been wrong. People stepped aside. Conversations hushed. The boy with the bicycle glanced at his friend, like he had been let in on a secret. My name, the one I answered to for 40 years, felt like a headline someone else had written. Shame is strange. It is loud and silent at once. I felt it crawl up my spine and settle behind my teeth. It made me small and ridiculous, like a man sitting on a stoop with a bag of his life. Something else happened too, quieter and more dangerous. Under the hurt, anger began to stir. Not the shouting kind. No, it was colder, steady, like a river that learns the shape of stone. It moved through me, slow and patient, cataloging every slight, every act that had led to this noon at the gate. The anger had a clarity I had not known I possessed. It did not demand immediate fireworks. It wanted truth. It wanted reckoning. I did not call out to her. I let the sound of my sandals on the pavement become the statement I could not form. I walked away with my small bag, my backbone a line I would not bend in public. The gate closed behind me, and the sound lodged in my ears. I did not look back until I reached the street lamp, a block away. Only then did I turn. She was standing in the shade now, the sun drawing hard edges on her face. She did not come after me. She did not call. I folded my shoulders against the heat and walked on. The world kept turning. The tiles under my feet were the same as they had always been, but the map had changed. I carried the photograph in my hand, and the image of her first day at school flashed behind my eyelids. Ribbon, crooked, eyes wide, clutching my hand like a life raft. I had promised to keep her safe. That promise did not evaporate because a paper changed hands. The promise lived in my bones, and even as my chest ached and the sun pressed on my head, something in me decided that losing a roof would not be the end of my story. It would be the first line of what came next. The week before everything collapsed still plays in my mind like a slow reel. I can see her sitting beside me on the sofa, the same sofa where she once curled up as a little girl with her school bag on her lap, waiting for me to check her homework. Her voice was soft that evening, almost musical. She placed a stack of papers on the table between us, smoothing the edges with careful fingers. "Papa," she said, "let me handle these things for you. Direct deposits, online bills, all those complicated messages. You won't have to worry." Her hand rested lightly on mine, warm and reassuring. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. After all, I had trusted those hands since the day they first gripped my finger in the hospital ward. We went to the bank the next morning. The official behind the desk spoke quickly, words flying like arrows. I couldn't catch. My daughter leaned close and translated each phrase slower, sweeter. She reshaped every sharp edge into something harmless. "It's only paperwork, Papa." A formality. She tilted her head, smiling the way she did, as a child whenever she wanted a toy. I signed. I didn't hesitate. Trust had become muscle memory by then, built over decades of bedtime stories, fever nights, and the proud day I walked her across a graduation stage. My name scrawled across those lines felt like another small gift to her, no different than the school books and dresses I had once bought without thinking. When I set the pen down, she let out a little laugh of relief. She leaned over, hugged me, and whispered, "My hero," for a moment. I felt 10 feet tall. My chest swelled with the old pride of a father who believes he has provided. That night, I slept easier than I had in months, without counting the coins in my head, without worrying how long the pension would stretch. I told myself I had done the right thing. The next morning, something shifted. Small things, almost invisible. My bank card disappeared into a drawer for safety. She explained it gently with the patience of a teacher to a child. Passwords I had written on a slip of paper were suddenly changed, replaced by numbers and letters I would never remember. My phone, which used to buzz with a pension message on the first of every month, stayed silent. I asked, careful not to sound accusing. She smiled quickly, almost too quickly, and said it was a technical issue. I wanted to press harder, but as I stood in the hallway, her husband appeared. His shadow filled the space before his body did. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes half amused. My words curled back into my throat, like frightened animals. I nodded, pretended I was satisfied with the explanation, and went back to my room. On Sunday I sat in the church pew, head bowed. The light filtered through stained glass, painting the floor in colors. I gave thanks for the peace I thought I had purchased with my signature. I told myself I was lucky, that my daughter cared enough to take responsibility, that I could finally rest. But by Tuesday the unease was undeniable. Doors closed when I approached. Her voice, once open and full, grew quiet when she spoke on the phone. Laughter I wasn't part of drifted from behind glass. I stood outside those rooms, my hand hovering near the handle, debating whether to knock. Each time I walked away, convincing myself it was nothing, just the way young people were these days. Private, busy, different. Still, the silence between us deepened like a crack in plaster that spreads quietly across a wall. I saw it, I felt it, but I chose to ignore it. I told myself smoke does not always mean fire. I told myself she was tired, distracted, preoccupied with work or friends. In the evenings I sat alone at the dining table, waiting for her to join me. Sometimes she did, rushing through a meal with her phone lighting up beside her plate. Sometimes she didn't, claiming she had already eaten. I kept my questions folded neatly in my chest, like letters I would never send. Looking back, I realized I was blind by choice. I wanted so desperately to hold on to the image of the little girl who once clung to me at the fair, who once cried until I bought her a second balloon because the first one slipped away into the sky. I wanted that memory to be real again, to stand between us like a shield. I didn't see what was happening, not fully. Not until the fire burned the roof above my head, and by then, it was too late. They watched like it was cinema. Faces at windows became a silent jury. I felt them before I saw them. The tilt of heads, the hush that trails behind doorways. The day I left my house, the street filled with small, sightless dramas. A boy crouched near his bicycle, pretending to tighten a loose bolt. His fingers moved like a practiced actor's. But his eyes followed me. He kept one ear cocked, as if my story might give him something new to rehearse with his friends. Across the road, Mrs. Pinto's curtain cracked open a sliver. 2 fingertips held the fabric like a rosary, and her lips moved in a rhythm that sounded like counting. I could imagine every syllable she whispered. Speculation, judgment, pity, mixed and served warm. Over in the alley, someone laughed. It was that short, cruel sound people make when they think they've stepped outside the rules of sympathy. A cousin I hadn't seen in months passed by, slowed for a heartbeat, then walked faster as if proximity might rub off. I might have caught his eye once. Now he kept his gaze low, on the ground, on his shoes, on anything but me. I stopped at the corner store for water. The bell above the door clicked in a tired way. I had heard 1,000 times. The shopkeeper stood behind the counter as if shielding himself. He placed the bottle on the counter with 2 fingers, as if it might burn him. No chatter. No small talk about the weather. Just a transaction wrapped in avoidance. I paid in coins heavier than my pockets. Heavier than my pride. Outside, the old bench leaned under the sun like a tired man. It was the bench that never saw the bus arrive, exactly when the timetable claimed. People used it because it was there, because the city had few places for pausing. I sat and set my bag beside me. Dust lifted in lazy spirals around my shoes, and a stray dog chose the lamppost shade for a nap, wholly uninterested in human dramas. It reminded me of the small cruelties of nature. Life goes on with utter indifference. My phone was a dead island in my hand. No messages. No missed calls. My daughter did not call. I placed a thumb over the screen. Composed words that felt heavy and clumsy and then deleted them. Sentences became small nails. I tried to hammer into nothing solid, but they bent and broke. I wrote a note and erased it. Wrote again, and burned the line with shame. What do you say to the one who closed your house? What do you say to the one who took what kept your light on? A man walked by, his laughter folding into the afternoon like a scarf. Balcony voices rose. Someone hummed a radio song. Someone else chopped vegetables with quick, contented rhythm. The city buzzed in its ordinary way, and I felt like a paused frame inside a moving reel. People lived whole lives around my shadow. Weddings, meals, arguments, jokes. None of it paused for the man with a small bag on a sun-worn bench. Hours became a slow metronome. I sipped water until the bottle warmed to the heat of my palm. Children shouted as they ran past. The sound bright and careless, like birds. A woman walked a stroller and smiled at me as one might nod at a stranger. Sympathetic but distant. I understood then why people avoid longer glances. Sympathy makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort drinks curiosity for breakfast. At some point, someone took a photograph. I did not see the camera lift. I only felt the prickle at the back of my neck. The sudden knowledge that my private collapse had been transmuted into public consumption. The photo spread like a small rumor. A caption followed. Someone's attempt to wrap my life in a lesson. Plan ahead. It said, old men should plan better. The words felt like a stone tossed into a shallow pond. Sharp and pointless. I swallowed a pebble of anger, not aloud but inward, and chased it with water. It tasted of metal and sun, and the cheap plastic of the bottle. Anger warmed for a second, then cooled. Shame filled the larger space. Shame is a slow animal. It pads around and nests in corners you once checked for mice. It made me keep my eyes low. It made my hands small. As evening smeared blue across the skyline, windows lit one by one, lights made cages of rooms, and inside them, People moved with the continuity of a life that asks little and gives less. Laughter climbed from terraces. Plates clinked. Footsteps echoed in stairwells that led to beds and to forgetting. The city softened, but I did not. I sat like a weathered thing, watching the spectacle of other people's warmth. Darkness crept in with the same indifferent step as everything else. The lamplight washed the street in candles of yellow. A stray cat slipped past, in and out of shadow. I noticed smaller details now. The way a shop sign hummed, the exact angle of a drain cover, the familiar squeak of the gate that used to welcome me home. They were all the same, only my place in the picture had changed. People returned to their rooms, shuttering themselves from the world and the world's discomfort. The balcony crowd thinned, and windows closed like eyelids. I sat longer, even as sounds became softer. I felt more isolated. The world had not paused for my ruin. Instead, it had continued: music, arguments, a child's bedtime story, moving with an almost cruel normalcy. When I finally rose, the bench complained in a small, tired way. My legs remembered how to walk, but my heart felt like something left on a doorstep. Exposed, hoping for someone to notice and bring it inside. I folded my thin coat across my shoulders and shouldered my small bag. The street swallowed me into its current. Cars passed, voices blurred. I walked until the houses thinned, and the lamplight softened, carrying the silence of a man who had become invisible to those he had known all his life. The first night without a roof was heavier than I imagined. I tried the shelters first. Their doors stood tall and indifferent, lines curling around corners like snakes. Men, women, even children waited with bags clutched close to their chests. A man with a clipboard moved down the line, voice clipped, eyes tired. When he reached me, he didn't ask my name. He only shook his head. "Full," he said, and moved on. So I kept walking until the park swallowed me. The bench there, old and uneven, became my bed. The metal slats pressed into my back, cold and unkind. The night air carried the smell of damp leaves and iron, like rain that hadn't fallen yet. I lay on my side and looked through the branches above. The stars winked faintly, scattered and distant. I gave them names, one by one. My wife's name first. Then my daughter's, though the word burned my tongue. Then friends I hadn't seen in years. Each light was a memory, and I held on to them because the darkness wanted to erase everything. Hunger came softly at first. A gentle knock on the ribs. Then louder, sharper, until it felt like an argument inside my stomach. Then, just as suddenly, it faded into quiet again, leaving only weakness behind. I drifted in and out of sleep, each hour stretching like a rope tied too tight. The next day I found a charity tent near the station. The line there was shorter, voices hushed. They handed me tea and a piece of bread. Steam curled up and fogged my glasses. I cupped the paper like it was treasure, holding it with both hands as if warmth might spill out. The bread was dry, but it filled the hollow just enough to make me grateful. Later, a boy no older than 10 shuffled past with a small packet of rice. He ate half, then stopped, his eyes flicking toward me. Without a word, he extended the packet. "Take it, uncle." His voice was soft, but it struck me like thunder. I nodded, accepting it with a hand that trembled from shame as much as from hunger. I ate slowly, every grain tasting like a sermon on humility. The public restroom smelled of bleach and rust. The mirror above the sink reflected a face I didn't know. Hollow eyes, unshaven jaw, lines deep enough to carry secrets. I touched the glass, half expecting it to shatter. The tap coughed when I turned it, spat twice, then gave up. I splashed what little water I could onto my face, wiping it away with the edge of my sleeve. For a moment, I looked less like a man and more like a ghost, pressed against the living world. Nights piled on top of each other, and silence grew thicker. Silence bruises differently than fists. It presses inward until your thoughts echo too loud. So I began to speak softly to myself, sometimes to my wife, as if she were still beside me. "I'm trying," I whispered. "I haven't given up yet." Other times to no one, just to push sound into the air so the quiet wouldn't crush me. I thought often about calling the police, about telling them everything, but each time I stopped. This was family. Family should be solved inside the walls of blood and memory, even if those walls had crumbled. I told myself I was still a father. Paperwork couldn't erase that. Betrayal couldn't either. At dawn, the pigeons came first. Their wings fluttered against the rising light. They claimed the bench with me, Their coups, steady and honest. They didn't care about titles or shame. They only cared about crumbs. I envied them for that. I pulled my shawl tighter, the fabric thin but still a shield. The world always looked softer in the morning, even when my body felt stiff and sore. Days began to form a rhythm. A strange new calendar. Morning light became a small exam proof. I had survived the night. Then came the hunt for food. For a kind word, for a place to rest until the sun fell again. Pain lived in my knees, in my back, but I prayed it stayed there, and didn't crawl into my mind. Because once pain makes a home in the head, it is harder to throw out. Each sunrise was another test I had never studied for. Yet I answered it anyway, one breath at a time. I survived, not because I wanted to, but because survival had become the only option left. And in that survival, I began to sense that the story wasn't finished. Something was waiting beyond the benches and the shadows. Something that still had my name written on it. Farida's shop glowed like a lantern at the end of a weary street. Not bright, never dazzling, just a dim yellow bulb swinging from a frayed wire, light catching the dust that floated in the air. The glass jar on the counter had a crack running through it. A line like an old scar, and yet it held its shape. Maybe that's why I trusted her place. It looked like survival, not perfection. The first time I stepped in, I had only coins that rattled like shame in my palm. My stomach was hollow, my throat dry. I asked for bread, but placed less money on the counter than I should have. Farida's eyes lingered on the coins, then on me. She didn't sigh, didn't frown. Instead, she slid a fresh bun across the counter with fingers that knew the geometry of hunger. "Pay me when you can," she said, her voice steady, not pitying. That difference mattered. Pity is a knife. Kindness is a... The bread was still warm, the crust soft. I carried it outside and ate slowly, as though each bite was a conversation. Later, when the shop emptied, I returned to wipe her steel kettle with a rag I found. I swept the threshold, pushing dust and fallen wrappers into the gutter. She didn't ask me to. I didn't explain why. We built a quiet language of small trades, bread for labor, tea for mended things. One day her drawer jammed, wood swollen from humidity. I fixed it with the edge of a spoon. She gave me a boiled egg wrapped in paper. No words, just the exchange. In those small gestures, I felt almost human again. She told me once, while slicing a guava with a steady hand, about her late husband. He was loud, she said, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. Always singing, always laughing. Now the rooms echo differently. I nodded. Silence had become my second skin too. We both knew what it was to walk through rooms where sound used to live. One evening, as she counted change for another customer, she glanced at me and said, "You should keep receipts." I frowned. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Proof," she explained. "You gave more than money to that house. Don't let them say otherwise." Memory fades. Paper remembers. Her words burrowed into me. That night I opened my small suitcase under the park light. Inside, under shirts folded too many times, I found an envelope. The paper had yellowed, the edges curled, but it was thick with my past. I pulled out slips one by one. Property tax stubs, tuition deposits, utility bills with my name pressed across the top, and then the bill for the white dress. My daughter had chosen it for her wedding, eyes bright, cheeks flushed. I had handed over the money without hesitation, thinking of her happiness, not mine. I spread the papers across my lap like fragile maps of a life. My hands smoothed each page as though I could iron out the years, as though pressing them flat would stitch me whole again. Each slip was a memory wrapped in ink. The long walk to the bank, the arguments with clerks, the sweat of overtime shifts. All of it had been poured into that house, into her future. The next day, I carried the envelope to Farida's shop. She pulled out a plastic sleeve from behind the counter, one meant for protecting school timetables and posters. Together we slid the papers inside. Her hands were careful, precise. "Don't lose this," she said, closing the sleeve. "One day, these will speak when no one else listens." I stared at the folder, heavy now in a way that felt different from shame. It was weight, yes, but also balance. A spine where before I had none, not yet anger, not yet a plan, but something had shifted. The drowning man in me had found his toes brushing the ground beneath the water, not firm, not steady, but there, feet still wet, lungs still tight, yet a hint that maybe, just maybe, I could stand again. That evening, as pigeons circled the rooftops and the city began its nightly hum, I sat on the bench with the plastic sleeve on my lap. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel entirely invisible. I had paper. I had a record of my existence, carved not in memory but in numbers, signatures and dates. The world had tried to erase me, but here in my hands was the evidence that I had built, paid, sacrificed. The night air was cool. I held the sleeve close, not just to guard it, but to feel it against me, a reminder that I was more than the man on the bench. I was the man who had built a home, who had raised a child, who had carried a family, paper remembered. Even if people forgot, and in that quiet, I whispered to my wife again. I'm still here. I'm still standing. The summer air carried whispers sharper than blades. They drifted toward me with the weight of dust and heat, settling in places I couldn't brush clean. At the tea stall, someone mentioned my daughter's new sofa, imported leather, the kind that smelled of money and magazines. Another voice added that they'd seen her car loaded for a weekend trip. Photos posted online of her smiling at a resort pool, sunglasses too large for her face. Her husband joked in the captions, mocking old-fashioned elders who didn't know how to live. The words crawled under my skin. It wasn't jealousy. Not exactly. It was stranger than that. Like reading a book I had written only to find my name erased from every page. The story was still mine, but I no longer belonged in it. On Friday, the music carried all the way to the park, bass thumping, laughter spilling out like broken glass, lights cutting through curtains. Someone said they were hosting parties now. New friends, new circles. The kind of gatherings where respect shrinks under alcohol and cheap bravado. The maid from across the street mentioned packages arriving daily, boxes with foreign stamps, plastic wrap peeled off in a hurry, each rumor stacked on top of the other, until I could barely breathe under their weight. Finally, I walked to the bank. I told myself it was just to ask, politely. Nothing more. The air conditioning inside bit my skin after the heat outside. A clerk in a pressed shirt greeted me with a rehearsed smile. Too smooth, too polished. I asked about my pension. His fingers tapped the keyboard. His tone steady, almost mechanical. It's being managed, he said. By who? I asked, though I already knew. He didn't flinch. Authorized person. The phrase slid into me like a thin knife. Sharp, cold, leaving no blood, but plenty of ache. I nodded, thanked him, and left. The courtesy in my voice sounded foreign, hollow. Outside, the afternoon light was cruel. It revealed everything too clearly. Across the street, by the bakery, I saw him, my daughter's husband. His laughter cut across the road. Loud, careless. He stood with a man I recognized from another lifetime. Years ago, I had seen him at gambling tables, smoke curling above his head, debts piling faster than the cards could turn. Their handshake looked greasy, slick with secrets. I froze behind the bus stop sign, pretending to read the timetable. My heart thudded like a frightened drum, loud enough I feared someone else might hear. I watched their smiles, the way their eyes darted around. Deals passed silently in gestures, in small envelopes, in debts that never ended clean. My chest tightened. I thought of the papers I had signed, of the screens I never learned to read, numbers and passwords, worlds that blinked in light I had never mastered. I had trusted ink and promises. They were playing with digits and shadows. In that moment, I realized I had been blind in a world that only spoke light. I had entered their game without knowing the rules, and they had stripped me of everything while I smiled and believed. I stayed there until they walked away, their laughter still ringing in my ears long after they turned the corner. My legs ached from standing still, but I could not move. The truth was a heavy stone pressing down, immovable. That evening, as the sun melted into orange, I sat outside Florida's shop. She was locking the shutter, the metal chain clinking in her hands. She looked at me, reading the storm in my eyes before She walked with me halfway to the park, her steps unhurried, her shawl pulled tight against the breeze. People can be ungrateful, she said finally, her voice flat, without decoration. But money makes them worse. The words didn't console me. They fell like heavy rocks into the hollow of my chest. I carried them in silence, not knowing whether they were a weapon to throw or a brick to build with. Each step felt slower, heavy. The streetlights hummed above, flickering weakly, as if even they couldn't decide whether to shine or fade. By the time I reached the bench, the city had grown loud again. Voices, laughter, engines, all rushing past me as if I were invisible. I placed my bag at my feet and held Farida's words in my mind. They were sharp, undeniable, and they left me with one thought that would not let go. If paper remembers, then maybe silence does too. Maybe silence, heavy and waiting, was the beginning of something larger than pain. I found it at the bottom of my suitcase, buried under shirts that smelled of dust and time. An old ledger, edges frayed, spines softened by years of being opened and closed. The pages carried my younger handwriting, small and neat. Numbers stacked like bricks, hospital fees from when my wife was sick. School books, uniforms, shoes too quickly outgrown. Interest paid on the small loan I had taken after she died. Each installment marked in ink that had faded but not disappeared. It wasn't just a ledger. It was proof of a life lived in service. Proof that I had carried the weight without asking anyone else to. I sat on the bench, the book heavy in my lap. My fingers traced the columns as though touching the scars of my own body. I remembered standing at bank counters, arguing with clerks, sweating under ceilings that dripped heat, just to make those payments. Each number was a memory. Each line a quiet testimony no one had ever heard. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pigeons cooed above me, the city hummed with its usual indifference, but something inside me stirred. Proof, Farida had said. Paper remembered. The next morning, I carried the ledger and the plastic sleeve she had helped me prepare. I walked slowly, the folder clutched against my chest as if it could be stolen by the wind. I made my way to an old office tucked behind the courthouse lanes, a place I had not visited in years. The name on the wooden door still read Advocate Surrey. Retired now, but still sharp, people said. His office smelled of dust, ink, and old battles. Files leaned against each other like tired soldiers. The ceiling fan squeaked with every turn. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were steady. He gestured for me to sit. I laid the ledger before him, then the plastic sleeve. He didn't rush. He flipped pages slowly, his pen tapping on the desk like a metronome, marking the rhythm of patience. He circled dates. He underlined figures. He sighed, not the sigh of dismissal, but of recognition. You've kept these all these years? He asked quietly. I didn't know why, I said. Until now. He nodded once, then leaned back. He began to speak of laws I had never heard of. Rules about pensions, clauses written for elder protection, limits on transfers made under what they called undue influence, words I barely understood, yet they sounded like a ladder lowered into the pit where I had been sinking. Not a promise, but a way up. Your case is not hopeless, he said, his pen now still. It will be a fight. There will be dirt thrown. They will call you names. They will try to paint you weak, confused. I let the words settle. Dirt could not scare me. I was already covered in it. What do I need to do? I asked. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. We start by freezing the account. No more withdrawals until a judge hears your side. For that, I'll need copies of everything. Keep your originals safe. Never let them out of your hands. I nodded, sliding the papers back into the sleeve. And one more thing, he added. Write everything down. Every memory, every humiliation, even the smallest insult. Judges don't just look at numbers. They look at patterns. They look at the story those numbers tell. I thought of the whispers in the street, the laughter in the alley, the way my daughter had closed the door while I stood outside like a beggar. Could such things live on paper? Could shame be written in ink? I promised him I would try. When I left his office, the folder was thinner than hope, but heavier than despair. Hope is not light. It requires strength to carry. It bends your back, forces you to walk carefully. But it is still better than emptiness. The sun was harsh when I stepped out, but the air tasted different. Not sweet, not safe, but edged with something I hadn't felt in months. Possibility. I clutched the folder tighter, as though it could slip through my fingers, and began the long walk back to the park. My feet were sore, my body tired, but the burden I carried now had meaning. For the first time since the gate had closed behind me, I wasn't only surviving. I was preparing. The petition felt heavier than any stone I had ever carried. Pages stacked neatly, words typed in black ink, but to me it was the weight of years pressed into paragraphs. Mr. Surrey handed me the affidavit. My fingers trembled as I held the pen, my name waiting at the bottom like a question. For a moment, I froze. Signing had betrayed me once before, but this was different. This was not surrender. This was stand. I drew my name slowly, each letter carved with the steadiness of a man who refused to vanish. My hands shook. Yes. But the line did not falter. The pen didn't betray me. When the last letter curled onto the page, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The clerk took the papers. His hands were brisk, practiced, moving each sheet into its tray with the rhythm of a machine. Then the stamps came, heavy, final, landing like drum beats on my heart. Thud, thud, thud. Each sound said, "It is recorded. It is official. It will not be ignored." The clerk looked at my age on the form. His eyes softened, and he lowered his voice. "My father is the same," he murmured. It was not pity. It was recognition. For once, my age did not feel like weakness. It felt like witness. When I stepped outside, the noon light wrapped me without judgment. The same sun that had once exposed me, shamed me, seemed now to simply exist. I closed my eyes for a second, breathing it in. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste like failure. Mr. Surrey walked beside me, his steps measured. "This is only the beginning," he said. "There will be notices, hearings, delays that stretch like rubber bands. They will test your patience. But patience is part of the fight." I nodded, listening. His voice was steady, like a teacher who wanted his student to pass not with brilliance but with endurance. "Stay reachable," he instructed. "Keep every record. Avoid confrontation. Let the paper do the shouting for you." That evening I didn't return to the bench. Instead, I found myself in the hallway of a small church. The priest allowed me to rest on a wooden pew. Candle wax lingered in the air, soft and sweet. It calmed me. I stretched out, the wood hard against my back, but my spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. Sleep took me into a memory. My daughter at 5, her hair tied in 2 uneven ponytails. We were at the park and she tugged my hand toward the swings. "2, Papa," she demanded. "Not 1, 2, always both." She wanted everything doubled, her laughter spilling out as I lifted her higher. The memory was bright, untarnished, untouched by the years that came later. I clung to it in the dream like a man clings to rope above a flood. Morning light streamed through stained glass, painting colors across the floor. As I stood, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message. My heart thumped as I read it. The court had granted a temporary order. No withdrawals beyond necessities until the matter could be heard fully. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was a wall against the rushing river. A small dam that slowed the flood, threatening to wash me away. My knees weakened, and I sat back down on the pew, gripping the phone like it was a relic. Later that day, a relative called. His voice was sharp, scolding. "Why are you washing family laundry in public? Do you know what people will say? Do you know the shame you bring?" I held the phone to my ear, silent. I let him pour his words, his blame, his defense of the very betrayal I had suffered. When he finished, I simply pressed the button and ended the call. I didn't have to explain myself to anyone anymore. That evening, I returned to Foreda's shop. She had already heard news travels fast in narrow streets. She brewed tea with cardamom, the aroma rising like hope itself. She handed me the tin cup with a grin. "First step," she said. I raised the cup, inhaled the warmth. The sweetness touched my tongue, and for a moment, I remembered what sweetness was meant to be. Not false promises, not poisoned smiles, but simple kindness given without demand. I drank it slowly, holding on to that taste as though it could anchor me. The fight ahead was still long. But for the first time since the gate had shut behind me, I felt something stronger than despair. I felt movement. The river was still loud, but I was no longer drowning. The retaliation came like weather, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. I woke to the world angled against me. My phone buzzed with messages I did not want. Neighbors pointed with polite horror. Someone outside the bakery muttered the gist. Then I found the post. She had written it carefully, each sentence a crystal, publicly polite, privately sharp. She called me confused, as if that one word could explain away decades of care. She said she only wanted to protect me, to shield me from my own mistakes. She hinted at episodes, the kind of word that tells a jury more than she ever intended. Her husband, never one to miss a chance, left a comment with a laugh and a joke about me forgetting birthdays, proof, he said, of decline. The small cruelty burned brighter, because it came with the veneer of concern. Old acquaintances chimed in with shaking head emojis, as if the shape of their digital hands could carry the weight of a life. A distant cousin sent a voice note. his voice laced with advice and pity. "Family is family," he said, and the tone made it sound like a warning, not a comfort. "Drop the case," he urged. "Let it go." He did not hear the ledger in my satchel. He did not know about the receipts tucked like confessions in a plastic sleeve. To him, the picture on his screen was enough. Mr. Suri's advice was a different kind of calm. He told me to stay silent. "Let the evidence speak," he said. The words were a prayer and a command. So I learned to practice silence like a discipline. I held my tongue as if it were a fragile relic. When people asked, I smiled with my eyes and nothing else. Silence became my shield. It was sometimes the only armor a man has when rivers of rumor try to drown him. At night, doubt became a companion who paced beside the bench. It would sit there like an unwelcome animal, circling, sniffing for weaknesses. What if the judge believes the polished story? What if the ledger is not enough and my name becomes a question in smirking mouths? I pressed my palms into the paper. Let the ledger's texture anchor me. The inked numbers and scrawled entries felt like a lifeline thrown into dark water. They were small, stubborn facts against the shouting world. Farida saw me one afternoon, with worry like a shadow. She put a small radio on the counter where I sat, and it filled the shop with ordinary voices. News, a song, an old talk show. Human noise can soothe in a way silence cannot. "Remember who you are," she said simply, handing me a cup of chai that steamed in the cool air. It was an order wrapped in care, the sort of thing that bolstered a man more than sermons or scolding. Her words were as plain and necessary as bread. I began to collect names like stones to build a path back. The mason who had laid the foundation of our back wall remembered the day I paid him in 2 installments when money was too thin. He could testify to the sweat that went into that house. The school clerk still had my receipt for fees paid in advance for a year, when my daughter wanted to study late nights. The driver who ferried people on festival days remembered the wedding car I had hired. The cash I handed over under the sun. Each person had a small shard of truth. Alone, they were small. Together, maybe they could be rope. Calling people felt like stepping into a cold room. I introduced myself in a voice that tried not to show the tremor. I explained simply, without drama, that I needed witnesses for a hearing. Most answered with silence that asked a price. Time, risk, inconvenient. A few said yes immediately, voices steady in a way that felt like sunlight. When by when I met them. The mason's hands were rough, and his eyes were kind. The school clerk folded his hands and fished out a faded file from a drawer. The driver laughed when I reminded him of the wedding day, then rubbed his beard and promised he would come to court. There were also refusals. A neighbor I thought loyal closed his door. A cousin who had once borrowed money stopped returning calls. Those losses stung like salt. But with each small yes, my rope grew firmer in my palms. I wrote everything down that Mr. Suri had told me to record. The tiny humiliations, the dates, the phrases they had used, even the way her husband had laughed when he opened the gate that last morning. Judges, they had said, look for patterns. So I became an archivist of wound. I cataloged the moments, the card taken for safety, the password changed, the night the TV went off, and the rooms went quiet. Each entry was precise, a slow stitch sewing a case from ragged cloth. At night I replayed the ledger and the names. I read the receipts aloud to myself in the park, and the words stopped feeling like ghosts. They became witnesses sitting on the bench beside me. In the hush of morning, pigeons shuffled, and I felt less alone. My shame remained, but it had a frame now, a history that even rumor could not erase. The world still spoke loudly, posts, jokes, messages. But in the quiet of proof I found a strange strength. The mud they threw might stain for a while. Dirt clings. But rope, when it is made of many threads, can lift a man out of the mire. I held the ledger, the names, and the small, stubborn faith that truth, patient and steady, would speak louder than a polished post. The courthouse smelled of old paper and nervous sweat. The corridor echoed with footsteps that weren't steady, with whispers that rose and fell like the tide. I sat on a hard bench, my folder clutched close, my heart beat louder than the shuffle of clerks moving past. When she arrived, I almost didn't recognize her. My daughter walked in wearing a pastel suit, pale pink that softened her features. Her face was composed, her eyes polished, every line rehearsed for sympathy. Behind her, her husband wore confidence like cologne, thick, overbearing, filling the corridor before his body did. They didn't look at me. I didn't look at them. We occupied the same hallway but lived in different worlds. The bailiff's voice called us in. The courtroom breathed wood and dust. Benches creaked. Shoes scraped. Whispers fluttered until the judge entered. The room stiffened, every head bowing in instinctive deference. Their lawyer stood first. He was smooth, practiced, his words like silk stretched over stone. "My client," he said, gesturing toward my daughter, "has only ever cared for her father. She has taken on the difficult duty of managing his affairs for his own protection. She shields him from modern complexities." His tone was almost tender, as if he were presenting a saint. I sat still, but inside, heat climbed my throat. Then came our turn. Mr. Suri rose, slowly, his papers neat in his hands. His voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, but each word landed with weight. He placed documents before the judge, one after another. Tax slips with my name, tuition receipts I had kept, bank transfer logs that showed the swift drain of funds. He pointed to the dates, highlighting how passwords changed almost immediately after my signature. Each thud of evidence struck the silence like a hammer. A bank clerk testified, his voice steady. He described unusual withdrawals, large amounts pulled in quick succession. The neighbor followed, recalling the eviction day, the way I had walked out with a single bag while my daughter stood behind the gate, their words carved holes in the story my daughter had painted. I looked at her face. For the first time it flickered. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. She could see the wall she had built beginning to crack. Her eyes shifted, searching the room, then dropped to her lap. Her thumbs rubbed circles against each other. Her husband's jaw clenched, muscles tight as rope. The lawyer tried to smooth it over, to patch the gaps with polished words. But facts weighed heavier than polish. The room could feel it. Even silence leaned toward the truth. Finally, the judge spoke. His words were clipped, deliberate. He issued a stronger interim order. Control of my pension would return to me, until the final decision. Any unnecessary spending was to be restrained. The sound of his gavel echoed in the chamber. A short note that rang like both warning and relief. I did not cheer. There was no joy. What I felt was straighter than joy. Heavier. Justice is not celebration. It is standing after being bent too long. It is the straightening of a back that had almost forgotten how. My daughter kept her gaze down. Her husband whispered something to her. His jaw still locked, his eyes darting at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I felt no triumph, only grief, the kind that sits beside relief. When it ended, I walked out of the courtroom with nothing more in my hands than a folded piece of paper. Thin, ordinary, no thicker than a school certificate, but it let me breathe again. Outside, the noon sun burned the steps, pigeons circled overhead, and the noise of the city washed around me. I stood there a moment longer, clutching the paper, not as a weapon, not as a prize, simply as proof that I was still here, that I had not been erased, that for one day the gavel had echoed in my favor, and the sound would carry me further than despair ever could. The weeks that followed moved like an old clock, not the kind that ticks loudly, but the kind that measures time with quiet patience. Slow, precise, relentless. Every day had its weight, and I carried each one carefully, waiting for the next turn of the gears. With my pension restored, I was able to rent a small room behind the church. 4 walls, a thin window, a narrow cot. To someone else, it might have looked bare, almost punishing. But to me, it was sanctuary. For the first time in months, the space was mine. No one could tell me to leave. No one could touch what little I had. On the very first morning, I lit the small stove. The flame caught, blue and obedient. I boiled water, dropped leaves into it, and added a pinch of sugar. When I poured the tea, I felt tears sting my eyes. I hadn't expected to cry. Yet there I was, an old man with a chipped cup, weeping because the flame obeyed me. Independence had its own taste. Bitter, sweet, sharp. It was the taste of boiled leaves and sugar, of something I controlled with my own hands. I thought of my daughter often. One evening, I tried calling her. The phone rang and rang unanswered. I left no words, only the sound of my breathing. Not a message of pleading. Not an argument. Just proof that I was alive. Perhaps one day she would hear that silence and know it carried more truth than any sentence I could form. Meanwhile, Mr. Suri pressed forward with the case. He filed the last set of papers with his usual calm precision. Each step, he said, was like adding another stone to a foundation. By the time the final hearing came, the judge had already read everything. The room was quiet that day, Almost subdued, my daughter and her husband sat together, their faces unreadable, their lawyer fidgeting with his notes. The judge spoke with efficiency. His order was clear: control of my pension would remain with me. Unauthorized transfers would be reversed. And most importantly, the house title would undergo corrective measures, acknowledging my contribution and the coercion that had forced my hand. The words were not dramatic, not loud, but they landed like anchors. For the first time, the weight shifted away from me. When the gavel fell, there was no cheer, no applause, only the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of feet. Outside the courtroom, I sat on the steps. Pigeons scattered in a sudden burst, wings flashing in the light, and then they returned, as they always did. Life scattered and returned. That was its rhythm. I thought of the photo in my suitcase, the one of my wife. In it, her eyes always looked a little to the side, as if she were watching something I could not see. I wondered what she would think of me now. Would she scold me for being too trusting, or would she place her hand on mine, the way she used to, and say nothing at all? I like to believe it would be the latter. That night, in my little room, I lay on the narrow cot. Sleep came softly, without the weight of benches or gates pressing against my chest. No dreams of being thrown out. No endless corridors of shame, just rest, deep and simple. The kind of sleep I had almost forgotten existed. In the morning, I folded my shirts carefully. A man with little must take care of what he has. Each crease was neat, deliberate, as though I could press order into my life with the same motion. The sun slipped through the small window, laying a pale stripe across the floor. Then came the knock. My heart lurched violently in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was her. My daughter returned, contrite, perhaps ready to bridge the distance. I opened the door with trembling hands. It wasn't her. It was Farida, holding a small box of ginger sweets and wearing a tired but genuine smile. "Weather's changing," she said. "Rain will come early this year." I exhaled, half in relief, half in disappointment. I invited her in. We sat by the small stove, sipping tea as the sweets melted sharp and warm on my tongue. We talked about the clouds gathering, about how the streets would flood if the drains clogged, about the way the pigeons grew restless before storms. We did not talk about daughters. Some silences are chosen, others are born from wounds too raw to touch. That morning, our silence was a shield. It protected us both. When she left, I stood at the doorway of my small room and watched the sky darken. Rain would come. Yes, but I felt steady enough to face it. The house I had lost still echoed with betrayal, but this room, this small, simple space, had no echoes at all, only the sound of my own breath, steady and alive. And sometimes that is enough. 3 months passed and life settled into a rhythm so quiet I sometimes wondered if the world had forgotten me. The church bell marked my Sundays like gentle commas, pausing the weeks without ending them. I watered a plant on my windowsill every morning, watching it lean toward the light, stubborn and slow. I taught myself how to cook rice without burning it, proud of the simple victories: steam rising soft, grains separate, not clump. The days were small, but they were mine. Then came that Monday. The air was heavy with heat, thick enough to press against my skin. Sweat gathered at the base of my neck. The church bell had already tolled. The pigeons had already scattered. And I sat near the stove, folding laundry with the care of a man who had little to fold. The knock came suddenly. Not loud, not frantic, just steady. A rhythm I knew without question. My heart jumped before my body moved. I stood frozen, listening to it again. I knew those knuckles. I knew the pause between strikes. A father learns the sound of his child's arrival, even after years, even after betrayal. I opened the door. There she was. My daughter. No pastel suit, no polished armor. Only a wrinkled shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her eyes were red, swollen from nights of tears. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her posture caved inward. Her strength dissolved. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Tears seized her throat, spilling faster than she could stop them. I stepped aside. She entered as though the chair might reject her. She sat on the edge, arms wrapped tight around her shawl, trembling.
I said nothing.
The silence stretched, and then, like water breaking through a crack, the story came. Between sobs, she told me everything. Her husband's debts, larger than she had ever guessed. The fights that grew sharper, nights that ended with slammed doors and broken promises. The night he left, abandoning her without warning, without even shame. The messages from lenders, cold words demanding money she didn't have. The friends who once filled their Friday parties now gone, their laughter vanishing with the credit cards. Her voice wavered with every confession. Each word fell heavier than the last. Then she looked at me, eyes wet, lips trembling, and said the words I had craved and feared. "Papa, I need you." The sentence tore me apart. Part of me wanted to gather her in my arms, to wipe her tears the way I had when she was a child, to promise her safety. Another part wanted to recoil, to pull my hand back and let her feel the full coldness of the world she had chosen over me. Both feelings throbbed inside the same heartbeat, tearing at me like two ropes pulling in opposite directions. I breathed slowly, steadying myself. "There are boundaries now," I told her. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, firm, not cruel. "The court gave me back what was mine. The pension, the papers. Help is not surrender, and I will not lose everything again. If I stand by you, it will be on conditions that protect us both." She nodded through tears, shoulders shaking, shawl slipping down her arm. She didn't argue. She didn't demand. She only listened, broken in a way I had never seen before. We sat in the quiet that follows storms. The air in the room felt different, heavy still, but no longer suffocating. I stood, lit the stove, and placed rice in the pot. The flame rose, obedient. The water hissed, steam rising like forgiveness half-formed. When I set the food before her, she took small bites. Careful, almost childlike. She chewed slowly, as though relearning how to eat in peace. I watched her, and for a moment, I saw not the woman who had cast me out, but the little girl with uneven ponytails demanding 2 swings instead of 1. I didn't forgive everything. Not yet. Wounds like mine do not close in a single meal. But I opened the window, letting air and sound slip in. Pigeons cooed outside. The breeze carried the scent of rain approaching. The room breathed again. We sat at the small table, 2 people bound by blood and fractured by choices, sharing rice cooked on a flame that behaved. And though I knew the path ahead was still uncertain, that night I allowed myself one fragile thought. Maybe broken things can still hold together, if handled with care.